Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today, we are joined by, I guess we can consider them repeat guests now. We heard from them back in December for some migration and habitat updates from Washington and Oregon. So today, we are going to be rejoined by Kyle Spragans and Brandon Reiches. And we're going to have a follow-up discussion to our previous episode, which was with Kelly Warren, where we talked about some goose harvest management issues in the Pacific Northwest. With Kelly, we spoke about those issues primarily from a hunter perspective. Kelly is obviously, as you heard in the previous episode, a Ducks Unlimited regional biologist in the Pacific Northwest. And of course, Kyle and Brandon are the state waterfowl biologists for those respective states that have a much larger responsibility and role in the harvest management decisions that affect birds in those states. So with that, let me formally welcome them to this podcast. Kyle Spragans, waterfowl section manager with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Kyle, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike.
And Brandon Reiches, migratory game bird coordinator for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Brandon, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Kyle, we're going to start with you for a personal and professional introduction and background. We didn't give you guys an opportunity on our previous discussion. We wanted to keep that one rather short, but this one is going to be a bit more extended conversation, and we'd like to give our guest an opportunity to introduce themselves to our listeners. So Kyle, tell us a bit about yourself, both personally and professionally.
Yep, I'm Kyle Spragans. I currently work for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, as Mike said, the waterfowl section manager. So overseeing, populations and surveys and decisions related to waterfowl in Washington. Along with that comes the responsibility of interacting with the Pacific Flyway Study Committee. In flyway management terms, it's sort of the syncing of the federal and the state processes that lead to the regulations that people kind of experience during the season. But for us in the background, it's sort of being able to gather various information from surveys and studies and other partners doing work out there on the ground to try and inform better decisions. So that's what I get to do now. So my background, luckily, has been quite a bit of waterfowl, but it's kind of been sprinkled across different agencies and experiences. I spent about 6 years with the U.S. Geological Survey, conducting waterfowl migration studies as part of research projects they had going on there. And then I spent 3 years up on the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a key area and for several of the geese that we might talk about today. So yeah, it's been a very West Coast oriented, but very Pacific Flyway oriented, and certainly very relevant to today's topic.
Thank you. And Brandon, same to you. Give us an introduction to your personal and professional background.
There's somewhat of a reoccurring theme out there among waterfowl biologists that I've noticed, and there's a lot of expatriate Minnesotans. So I am one of them. I grew up on a small farm in Southwest Minnesota. Got an undergrad degree in wildlife and fisheries sciences from South Dakota State University, and then actually started working as a seasonal position with Ducks Unlimited on a research project in the Great Lakes that they were doing in the early 2000s. That morphed into me coming out to Oregon for graduate school. And I guess I've just been here ever since. I started with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife pretty soon out of school in around 2005, and was first what we call our assistant game bird biologist in our game birds program. And then about, 7 years ago now, almost 8 years ago, got the migratory game bird coordinator position, which, it's kind of a little bit of a mouthful, but typically people just call it the state waterfowl biologist, even though I have doves and bandtail pigeons and snipe and other migratory game birds under my hat. So been in that position, very similar to what Kyle said as far as, responsibilities, kind of overseeing the state's management programs, as well as interacting with the flyway, which is a big portion, I think, of all of our state waterfowl biologist type jobs. pretty avid bird hunter myself. Like I think a lot of our counterparts are. So yeah, that's probably my first thing is duck hunting before getting into big game or anything like that.
Thank you, guys. Thank you both for those introductions. In the interest of time, out of respect for your time, let's move into our discussion here. And I did say already that this is going to be a complement to what we spoke about with Kelly. Kelly brought this idea to us and said, hey, we have some pretty unusual and some might say complex goose harvest management issues that are rather unique in the Pacific Northwest. And I think this would be something that a lot of our listeners would be interested in. So we looked into it. And there's a lot to learn here. And so on today's episode, we are going to shift gears and talk in a bit more detail about what goes into the harvest management decision-making around these geese. But we're also going to and this is where we'll start, talk about the history of the goose distribution and abundance to some extent in those states. So I guess that's probably as good a place to start as any, other than for me to tell our listeners that if you have not yet listened to the episode with Kelly, I would encourage you to do that. It would have come out immediately before this one. That's going to sort of set this discussion up a bit for you. So I guess first off, Brandon, I'll direct this question to you. Having already introduced these 7 subspecies with Kelly, Brandon, talk with us about the general pattern and history of white-cheeked geese in the Pacific Northwest. We will have a chance also to talk about snow geese and white-fronted geese, but it might be better to hold that to the end. So let's just focus on white-cheeked geese right now. Tell us a story about those birds in the Pacific Northwest.
So I think, as probably some of the listeners may know, the white-cheeked goose complex, or what people typically just call Canada geese. There's 11 recognized subspecies across the continent, right? It's a pretty large area. 7 of those can occur right here in Northwest Oregon, Southwest Washington. So one small chunk of the continent can host up to 7 different subspecies of those 11. And so that certainly creates a kind of a management challenge when each of those subspecies is also generally managed as a different management population with different goals and objectives for their population status. So kind of a brief recap of what we deal with here. I'll start from the largest and work my way down. So first is what we call the Western Canada goose. And most folks will just recognize that as your regular Canada goose. Some people out here do call them giants. They're not specifically the giant subspecies, but most people would have an extremely difficult time telling them apart. So they're your typical 9, 10, 11 pound Canada goose, very silvery chested in most cases. They just look like a regular goose. Those are also our resident birds. So we certainly get some migrants of those coming from the north, but those are the birds that nest here as well, both throughout Oregon and Washington, and really the entire Western United States and kind of southern British Columbia, southern Alberta, in those areas. Then next in size would be the Vancouver Canada goose. So that's another relatively large subspecies, but it is very dark chested. They are mostly resident in Southeast Alaska. So we're talking kind of those coastal areas of Southeast Alaska, mostly Northwest British Columbia. There is some historical accounts that they may have nested, almost all the way to Washington, but who really knows in some of those accounts. But right now, you can find those birds anywhere from Southwest Alaska down into coastal British Columbia. Generally a non-migratory subspecies. There is some evidence that a small portion of the flock does migrate and ends up down in colonized areas. However, they're extremely difficult to tell apart from a dusky Canada goose other than just size. And so from a field standpoint, I certainly would not hang my hat on ever looking at a goose in the field and saying that's a Vancouver versus a dusky. And I doubt Kyle would either. We've measured a lot of birds throughout history here in hunter check stations. Some have keyed out as Vancouvers, but if they actually were, is maybe up for debate. The next down in size is that dusky Canada goose that I just mentioned. It is the main driver of a lot of our harvest complexity here, and we'll get into that later. Those birds have one of the most restricted breeding ranges of any of the goose populations on the continent. They nest exclusively on the Copper River Delta in Alaska, as well as some of the adjacent islands in Prince William Sound, and then an island that's about 80 miles offshore of the Copper River Delta called Middleton Island. That's the breeding range. That's it. Really, really small. And therefore, they've got a relatively small population size. We're talking 15,000 birds. Some of those birds do spend the winter up in those areas. Some may winter along the British Columbia, Southeast Alaska coast, but the vast majority of them migrate to Northwest Oregon and Southwest Washington. And they probably almost always have. We don't think there's been a lot of range shifts, although historically before, the valley was broken up for agriculture and things like that, they may have been more of a coastal wintering bird than they are now. Next in size is the lesser Canada goose. This is a pretty tough one, I think, for most folks to ID and even managers. Basically, they're just a small version of what most folks consider, a regular Canada goose. Typically, maybe a 5 or 6 pound bird, slightly smaller than a dusky. Those duskies that I mentioned, they're 6, 7 pound birds, maybe 8 pound birds. But again, very, very dark chested. The lessers generally just aren't as dark chested. They nest in kind of interior portions of Alaska, all the way down to around the Anchorage area and in the Upper Cook Inlet. But typically, they're what you would consider finding out in maybe a beaver pond or kind of a river slough up in Alaska, something like that. Whereas the other species that we'll get into here in a second, would be more of a tundra type environment. So those lessers, we don't know a lot about them as far as population status. We do get some trend information from the waterfowl surveys in Alaska, but they're certainly not an extremely numerous bird. But they do seem to be pretty widespread in wintering in Oregon and Washington, and not specifically just this Northwest Oregon, Southwest Washington. They do winter in pretty good numbers in some eastern areas of our states as well. Next, then we enter, what we now call the Cackling goose complex. But again, we're going to kind of keep this simple and just call them all white-cheeked geese. So we have the Taverner's goose. So they're a subspecies that nests in Alaska, typically in more tundra type areas. However, they're extremely similar to lesser Canada geese. When we do our goose ID materials that Kelly may have touched on, he's actually helped the development of some of those. We talk about them separately, but from a management standpoint in hand, even for biologists, they're almost impossible to tell apart. The measurements overlap, color overlaps. So they're really, really similar. And, for all intents and purposes, we kind of lump them as Taverner's lessers. They are more abundant than lessers based on the survey information that we have from Alaska. And then, just kind of general feelings that you would get down here looking at birds coming through check stations and things. So they're about the size of a snow goose. Not a very big goose, but not tiny. Also. They can be pretty variable in their color. But one of the things we do know about Taverners is that they experienced a range shift. In the 1960s and 70s, most of those birds would have wintered in California, and then over time they discovered the agricultural regions here in the Willamette Valley and in other areas of Oregon and Washington, and have pretty much for all we know, almost entirely shifted out of California. But it happened a long time ago. We're talking human generations ago. And then throughout the 60s and 70s, they kind of switched and just moved further north, due to agricultural shifts, maybe, all the first signs of, the changing climate, who knows. But they did pretty much switch entirely to this area. And that kind of started the whole issue behind agricultural damage. You had a large swing in numbers where the population may not have been any bigger than it was, but that population moved into an area that was not experienced in dealing with large numbers of wintering Canada geese. And the agricultural base here in Western Oregon, Western Washington, we're a relatively mild climate, so we do have a winter growing season. So you have a lot of green forage on the landscape. It's not waste grain. It's winter grasses, be it winter wheat and other winter cereals, or other types of grasses that are being grown for seed that are green during the winter and attractive to geese. The next species that we deal with, or subspecies that we deal with, are the Aleutians. And so they are, they've had some complexity over the years, but that has waned. So as some of the listeners may know, the Aleutian goose was once on the endangered species list, may have numbered fewer than 1,000 individuals. Those birds nest on the Aleutian Islands, as their name suggests, up in Alaska. And that Aleutian Island chain is a geographically, it's almost hard to wrap your mind around how long that chain of islands goes. And it basically goes all the way over to Siberia. And the birds, most of them actually nest well out on those islands. They're not nesting close to the mainland of Alaska. Those birds still mostly winter in California. However, some of the migrants do hit the coastal areas of Oregon and Washington. And we do have a small wintering flock in Oregon, specifically in Tillamook County. Their numbers have rebounded significantly, though. The issue with them being, what caused their low numbers was introduced foxes on those Aleutian Islands that were introduced for fur farming purposes. And those geese had evolved with no mammalian predators. And so, pretty simple for fox to just go out there and hammer on, nests and adult birds. When the foxes were removed for, specifically to aid Aleutians and other nesting seabirds and water birds out there, they responded extremely well. The habitat in the wintering grounds was good. Lots of agriculture, lots of secure wetlands, things like that. And they've done extremely well. We may now be talking somewhere up around 200,000 Aleutian geese in the flyway. Thankfully, mostly wintering in California. Then the last subspecies is our smallest subspecies, what we've always referred to as the cackler out here. So they're the Minima cackling geese now. Those birds nest on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in western Alaska, so pretty restricted breeding range. But that Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta is one of, certainly the most important goose breeding area in Alaska, if not on the continent. For the number of birds that are smashed into a pretty small area. So we're talking these cackling geese, some of the Taverner's cackling geese, brant, emperor geese, white-fronted geese, and all multitudes of ducks and other water birds. So a really important area. And this population also historically wintered in California, similar to the Taverners. And it went through a significant population reduction in the 60s into the 70s and the early 1980s. And in fact, the season for both sport harvest in the Pacific Flyway as well as subsistence harvest on that Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, where there is this, a very large Alaska Native population, and they're important for their subsistence up there. The population, essentially crashed. Went from a few 100,000 birds down to an estimated about 25,000. So significant population reduction. And the season was closed for subsistence and sport harvest in 1984. That season closure allowed those birds to respond pretty rapidly. The population information we have is, nearly a straight line of increase from 1984 until about 1998, so somewhere around in there. If you look at that rate of increase, and then you also look at the rate that the birds were changing their wintering areas, they match. And so at the time that population was growing, and they went through a severe population bottleneck, of course, they were also switching their wintering grounds from California to Northwest Oregon, Southwest Washington. And by about 1994, which coincidentally is the year the hunting season reopened on those birds, they had almost entirely switched from California to this area. And so I mentioned the Taverners kind of opening this door in this region of our states to kind of an agricultural damage issue. And then we dumped another now 200 to 300,000 birds on top of it. So population estimate right now for cacklers is just above 200,000, but it has been recently as high as 300,000. And of course, we didn't have an estimate last year due to COVID, but there's certainly an abundant wintering bird here. They are our most abundant wintering white-cheeked goose by far. And they are kind of the drivers of some of the headaches from a damage to agricultural standpoint that we deal with now. That's really it, I guess, in a large nutshell. We've got a very diverse suite of wintering types of Canada geese here that all have their different management challenges and population goals and trajectories.
Brandon, that was awesome. Thank you for that detailed and very informative explanation. This is an episode for that discussion alone that I'm going to personally bookmark so that I can go back to and educate myself on the white-cheeked geese subspecies, if we want to call them that. I've never studied white-cheeked geese a whole lot. I'll have to confess that. So that was very informative from my perspective. So thank you for that. You spoke about the Taverners and the Cacklers as having been the ones that have shown, primarily the ones showing the distributional shift. Are there any of the other subspecies for which you're currently seeing shifts? I know you talked about the Aleutians still primarily wintering in California. Is there any shift occurring with those that's being picked up, or any of the other species?
From a California to Oregon standpoint, no, not on the Aleutians. The issue with the Aleutians is they are certainly more noticeable here. That's because the population is a couple orders of magnitude higher than it once was, and so there's just a lot more Aleutians in the flyway. Maybe some indications that there are some, there's shifting areas in California, and Kyle could certainly speak a lot better to that than I could, because he's pretty close with those birds from his graduate work. But they certainly have exploited new areas in California, and we've been a little fearful of that may eventually happen here in Oregon. But to this time point in Oregon, we haven't seen anything that we call a population shift. We've simply just seen more Aleutians in the areas that they've historically used, and that's just due to the overall population growth.
Kyle, I'll go to you now for a follow-up question. And this is a bit of curiosity here, but the Aleutians are not showing the shift to the Pacific Northwest the way some of these other subspecies are. Why do we think that is? Do they do some overwater? Do they have an overwater migration route from the Aleutian Islands to California, or do they kind of follow the mainland? What's the story there on why we're not seeing as much of a shift for that subspecies?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The general trend that Brandon is referring to there is that the large-bodied white-cheeked geese, the Canada geese, don't really show any kinds of shifts, but the smaller ones have. And whether that's Tavener, the Cacklers, with Aleutians, it's difficult because the reality is we don't really have a benchmark of what was. They were so depressed in their population size by the time that any of the strings of Endangered Species Act or the predecessors to that, those types of protections, that it's really hard to know. It's like, okay, the less than 1,000 birds on the landscape, what did it used to look like? Certainly as the populations rebounded, so what was less than 1,000 birds now is somewhere in the 120,000 population size range. But you're right. Brandon mentioned that they nest very far west in the Aleutian Island chain, thousands of miles off of Alaska. And for the most part, as far as we can tell, yes, there are definitely birds that basically beeline over the ocean and make landfall somewhere between Southwest Washington and Northern California on their way into the Central Valley, parts of the Central Valley and San Joaquin valleys of California. Some of the descriptions that have started to come out of that was in certain areas, particularly in Northern California and the Oregon coast, those areas were largely described as a spring stop. So during the spring months, you'd sort of get this bulk of birds that come passing back through. But more recently, they've been logging pretty decent numbers of Aleutian geese touching down in the fall and kind of, broadening the window of time that they're actually in some of those areas. So there's little hints of change, not nearly as dramatic as the cackler and the taverners. But yeah, those small geese, for whatever reason, seem to be more influenced potentially by subtle changes, whether that's agriculture, different weather patterns or something like that. Something is a little bit more easily teetered into sort of a need to shift.
When we combine all of these subspecies of white-cheeked geese that could possibly occur in Washington and Oregon, what do we think or what do we know would be the peak winter population size across all those subspecies combined?
I'll kind of put a caveat in there that we don't have any winter index of those birds. They're it's extremely difficult to count wintering dark geese from aircraft simply because they many times blend in with fields, and you can't just go to the big marshes and count them, right? Because they're geese and they're not in the marshes. They're out generally in agricultural fields. But if we start to add up what we think we know for breeding population sizes, if we've got 200,000 or in some years more of those smallest cackling geese, and we know that nearly all of them are wintering in this region. There are still a small number that winter in the Central Valley of California, and there's actually a small number, maybe a similar number, that winter in the eastern sides of Oregon and Washington. So right there, you can just ballpark it at 200,000. And then if we throw in, maybe 50,000 taverners, and that's a big maybe. The index, the numbers that we get from Alaska on taverners are truly an index. What gets reported out is not a population estimate. I think that a lot of times people look at it and assume that it is, but it's not. It's just an index that helps us assess trends. And so, best guess, and this has always been the best guess, it's persisted for probably 40 years, maybe 50,000 taverners, give or take. And those are going to be the two most abundant wintering white-cheeked geese. So then we throw in our 15,000 or so dust geese. It probably, smaller numbers of lessers in this region than that. But again, we have very, very really no reliable population size estimates for those guys, just some trend information. And then, Western Canada geese, which, there's certainly not, there's not huge numbers of them here. Most of the birds that are in this side of the state in the winter are probably resident birds, probably not a whole lot of migrant birds that trickle into this area. So, you can probably throw another 10, 15,000, onto that. So you start adding all those numbers up. And, right now you might be approaching 300,000. And then just, 5 or 6 years ago when the cacklers were themselves nearing 300,000 birds, you're talking 350 or more. So that's our best guess. But again, it's just trying to add up what we think we know about population status. It's not a concrete number.
And to give people that may not be familiar with some of these areas in Washington and Oregon, it's not like that number, 350,000 or so, is spread across the entirety of the two states. We're talking about a pretty restricted geography where these birds occur, right, Brandon?
Yeah, that's right. So from a, for just kind of a geography lesson for the listeners, the Willamette Valley in Oregon is the main wintering area. The Willamette Valley stretches from Eugene, where the Oregon Ducks play, all the way up to Portland, which so that's like about 100-mile stretch north to south. And then the valley these are pretty broad valley, in some areas approaching maybe 30 miles wide, but probably averaging more on the, 20 miles wide, 20, 25 miles wide. So it's a pretty big chunk of real estate. And then we've got to include a few of the coastal estuaries that are just on the other side of our Coast Range Mountains, so that divide the Willamette Valley from the ocean. And some of those estuaries have some goose wintering habitat, pastures, and things like that. And then when we get into Kyle's country, I'll kind of let him take it, but it's a much reduced area that we're talking about.
Yeah, this area in Washington, the sort of equivalent zone where we're talking about the overlap of all 7 of these white-cheeked geese, it's a much narrower ribbon in southwest Washington. It really touches sort of our 5 southwest counties along basically small little valley agricultural pockets along the lower Columbia River, so where the Columbia River exits out into the Pacific Ocean. And then up a little bit, we have 2 major bays, Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor. And so there's a couple of inland valleys that run off of those coastal bays that are really the main spot of sort of this overlap. For Washington, we have this sort of additional side that we talk about over in the Columbia Basin on the east side of the Cascades, the drier area of the state, where it's a much more irrigated cropland type habitat. And on that side, we do get strong numbers of Taverners and Lessers mixed in with Western Canada geese. So on that side, it's devoid of the dusky Canada goose conversation. But we still have these others that are in the mix that we have to think about for harvest regulation purposes.
When we have 7 subspecies of a bird in a relatively small geography like this, naturally people want to think about and talk about hybridization and the potential for it to occur. Brandon, what can you tell me about that? I know you get that question as a state waterfowl biologist more than one time every year.
I always started, I guess, with anything's possible, but these goose populations have evolved, and we're not just talking these goose populations. We're talking goose populations across, essentially the northern hemisphere and maybe the world. I'm just not familiar with a lot of the southern hemisphere, how those populations move around and how they've kind of how they come and go. Geese, mate for life, or at least they what I like to caveat that with is, they mate for the life of the other individual. They certainly do repair. So, they establish pair bonds with another goose, but they're migrating in these almost family flock kind of instances. And then they're breeding in these discrete areas that generally aren't, directly adjacent to the other populations. So if you take Aleutian geese, those birds are breeding out on the Aleutian Islands. So, you would have to get pairing to occur over the winter between the subspecies for, that hybridization to occur. And the same could go for cacklers and Taverners, or, even Taverners and Lessers. And so, well, it certainly can occur. The biology of these goose populations keeps it at very low levels, such that if it did occur, you actually produced viable offspring. The chances of them kind of perpetuating those crossbred genes would be extremely slim, because if they're genetically viable themselves, they're just going to pair back into or breed back into either of their parents. Very quickly are going to swamp out anything that might have been different. So while it can occur, we have no evidence that it's occurring at a large enough scale where it is somehow changing the composition of the subspecies or our management populations.
I'm glad you added that last part, because we had an extended discussion with Dr. Phil Lavretsky about mallard genetics, the genetics of the family of mallards, the mallard complex, and hybridization between mallards and black ducks, or mallards and monoducks. And he shared that they are learning the exact same thing that you described for the geese, and they're learning it for the mallard complex. And that as long as those hybrids are breeding back into one of those parent lineages, after a couple of breedings, their offspring are essentially back to a pure species or subspecies, as might be the case in here. So that was an unexpected connection that you brought in there, Brandon, to one of our previous episodes that I can share was very popular. And if anyone listening to this has not yet listened to those episodes, I would encourage you to do so. So let's see, guys. We're at a point here where maybe one more question, and then we will wrap this one up. And it relates, since we're talking about subspecies and hybridization and things of that nature. Maybe this is, I'll throw this out there because it popped into my head, and it stems from something that Kelly mentioned in the previous episode, where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is kind of moving towards a recognition of the new taxonomic designation issued by the American Ornithological Society for Canada geese and cackling geese, having two species, and I guess there would probably be some subspecies designation under those, but that might actually be part of the answer to the question I'm about to ask. How will will that recognition of two species, Canada geese and cackling geese, complicate any of the harvest management of the birds that we're talking about here? And just to kind of clarify, our next episode here is going to get into the details of that harvest management, the harvest management issues. But is this new AOS taxonomic designation any kind of complication for harvest management issues? Kyle, I'll go to you for that question.
Yeah, that taxonomic change from the AOU has been around since 2004, I think, is when that was sort of decided upon. And so from a taxonomic standpoint, yeah, it makes sense. There's definitely DNA support that says Canada geese, the large-bodied ones, differentiate from these cackling geese, the small-bodied versions. There was separation. Where there had always been sort of conversation beyond that is how that translates into management. As we're talking about, it's, we view these 7 subspecies that occur in this zone kind of as a grouping that we have to wrestle with the management, considerations, and how do you allow harvest on some but not on others in this system. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recognition, which I believe is passing through the process right now. The only piece that complicates a little bit is a very popular decision in sort of harvest management recently has been to separate out bag limits of the different types of geese. So there's a bag limit for Canada geese. There's a separate bag limit for snow geese. There's a separate bag limit for white-fronted from the management world view, looking at Canada geese and cackling geese as separate species, we just have to merge the fact that that's sort of the same thing. We are not going to create separate bag limits because of the difficulty of actually looking, as a hunter, trying to pick out the different Canada and cackling goose subspecies. So to create separate bag limits would be very arduous on the hunters themselves. And so, we would just have to take steps to actually sort of merge the language to make sure that those two are combined into one combo group for the bag limit considerations.
And Kyle, that's going to provide a very useful transition to what we will talk about on the next episode, where when we have subspecies whose population status is different, sort of on either different trajectories or at different stages, some are of greater conservation and management concern than others from a kind of population stability standpoint or population trajectory standpoint. And if we are challenged in some way to kind of differentiate those on the wing as hunters, then the harvest managers need to take certain steps and get creative sometimes to figure out how to reduce harvest pressure on those birds without making it too cumbersome for waterfowl hunters. And so that's what you guys, as state waterfowl biologists and key players in the harvest management decision process, are charged with doing, and you all have done admirable jobs of that over the years. And so that will be the focus of the next episode here with respect to how it affects these white-cheeked geese in the Pacific Northwest. So guys, I think we'll wrap up this episode and start another one. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time, and we'll pick up here on the next episode. So Brandon, Kyle, thank you guys.
Great. Thanks, Mike.
You bet.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Brandon Reiches, Migratory Game Bird Coordinator with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Kyle Spraggins, Waterfowl Section Manager for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great work that he does editing these episodes and getting them out to you. And of course, to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and spending it with us here on the podcast. And we thank you for your support of wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.